In the picturesque neighborhood of Maplewood, the Anderson family had finally found what they believed to be their dream home. The neighborhood was everything they had hoped for. Beautiful houses lined the quiet streets, each with perfectly manicured lawns and blooming flower beds that added a vibrant touch to the serene environment. Tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting dappled shadows over the sidewalks where children rode their bikes and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings. It was a place where life seemed peaceful and ideal, a community where the Andersons envisioned raising their two children in safety and comfort. The Anderson family, consisting of James, his wife Angela, and their two young children Maya and Caleb, were filled with excitement as they unloaded the moving truck. They had spent years saving up for this home, carefully planning every detail of their new life in Maplewood. As they carried boxes and furniture into their house, they couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment and joy. This was the start of something wonderful, a fresh chapter in a place that promised stability and happiness. James and Angela were both successful professionals. James had recently been appointed as the police chief of the local precinct, a position he was proud of and had worked hard to achieve. Angela, a school teacher, looked forward to getting involved in the local school district and contributing to the education of the neighborhood's children. Their children, Maya and Caleb, were equally excited, eager to make new friends and explore the parks and playgrounds they had seen during their visits to the area. As the day wore on, the Andersons began to meet their new neighbors. Some greeted them warmly, offering smiles and words of welcome, while others seemed more reserved, observing the new family with a mixture of curiosity and caution. It was during these initial interactions that they first encountered Mrs. Robinson, a longtime resident of Maplewood who lived directly across the street. Mrs. Robinson was a woman in her late 60s, with a sharp, angular face that rarely broke into a smile. She had lived in Maplewood for over 30 years and was known by many as a figure of authority in the community. She kept a watchful eye on the neighborhood, always aware of who was coming and going. To many, she was the unofficial gatekeeper of Maplewood, someone who upheld the standards and traditions of the area with unwavering dedication. When the Andersons first approached Mrs. Robinson to introduce themselves, they were met with a cold, almost dismissive response. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the new family. James extended his hand, offering a warm smile, but Mrs. Robinson merely glanced at it before looking away, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Robinson," James began, trying to break the ice. "We're the Andersons. We just moved in across the street and wanted to say hello." Mrs. Robinson nodded slightly, her expression remaining unchanged. "Yes, I saw the moving truck," she replied curtly, her tone devoid of warmth. "Welcome to the neighborhood." There was an awkward pause as James and Angela exchanged glances, unsure of how to continue the conversation. Sensing the tension, Angela spoke up, trying to find common ground. "We've heard such great things about Maplewood. It's such a beautiful place, and we're really looking forward to being a part of the community." Mrs. Robinson's gaze flickered briefly, but her demeanor remained icy. "It's a quiet neighborhood," she said flatly. "People here value peace and order." With that, she turned and walked back into her house, leaving the Andersons standing on the sidewalk, feeling the chill of her words. It was clear that Mrs. Robinson was not interested in getting to know them, and her cold reception left them with an uneasy feeling. As the days went by, the Andersons continued to settle into their new home. They made an effort to connect with their neighbors, attending local events and striking up conversations whenever possible. However, they couldn't shake the sense of being outsiders. While some neighbors were polite and even friendly, there was a subtle undercurrent of distance that permeated their interactions. It was as if they were being held at arm's length, with polite smiles masking a deeper reluctance to fully accept them into the fold. This unspoken tension was most evident in their encounters with Mrs. Robinson. Whenever they saw her, she would either avoid eye contact or offer only the briefest of acknowledgments. It became clear that her initial coldness was not just a one-time occurrence, but a reflection of her overall attitude toward the Andersons. Despite their efforts to bridge the gap, Mrs. Robinson's demeanor remained frosty, a barrier that they couldn't seem to penetrate. The Andersons tried to remain optimistic, refusing to let Mrs. Robinson's attitude dampen their spirits. They focused on creating a warm and welcoming home, filling it with love and laughter. They continued to greet their neighbors, attend community gatherings, and participate in local activities. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't ignore the undercurrent of hostility that seemed to linger just beneath the surface. It wasn't just Mrs. Robinson who seemed resistant to their presence. Other neighbors, while not as openly cold, displayed subtle signs of discomfort. Conversations would often be brief, with neighbors quickly excusing themselves or changing the subject when the Andersons tried to engage in deeper discussions. Invitations to social gatherings were rare, and when they did attend, they often found themselves on the periphery, included but not fully embraced. Despite these challenges, the Andersons remained hopeful. They believed that with time, they could win over their neighbors and become an integral part of the community. They were determined to prove that they belonged in Maplewood, that they could contribute positively to the neighborhood and build lasting relationships. It was with this mindset that they decided to host a neighborhood barbecue. James and Angela saw it as an opportunity to break down barriers and foster a sense of camaraderie. They spent weeks planning the event, sending out invitations to every household in the neighborhood. They wanted to create an atmosphere of warmth and inclusivity, where everyone could come together and enjoy good food, music, and conversation. On the day of the barbecue, the Andersons went all out. They decorated their backyard with colorful streamers and lights, set up tables laden with delicious food, and even arranged for games and activities for the children. The smell of grilled meat and the sound of lively music filled the air, creating a festive ambiance that they hoped would draw in their neighbors. As the afternoon wore on, guests began to arrive. At first, the turnout was modest, with a few families trickling in, offering polite greetings and compliments on the setup. The Andersons welcomed each guest with genuine warmth, eager to make everyone feel at home. Slowly, more neighbors arrived, and soon the backyard was filled with people chatting, laughing, and enjoying the food. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Andersons' efforts were paying off. The atmosphere was light and cheerful, and even the more reserved neighbors began to relax and engage in conversation. James and Angela moved through the crowd, mingling with their guests, feeling a sense of accomplishment as they saw the community coming together. However, as the barbecue continued, James couldn't help but notice Mrs. Robinson standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the festivities with a sour expression. She had arrived late, and while she had accepted their invitation, it was clear that she wasn't there to enjoy herself. She stood apart from the others, arms crossed, her face set in a disapproving frown as she observed the scene. James approached her, determined to make one last effort to connect. "Mrs. Robinson, we're so glad you could make it," he said, offering her a drink. She looked at him with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she replied, her tone clipped. "I see you've put a lot of effort into this event." "We really wanted to bring everyone together," James said, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's important to us to create a sense of community." Mrs. Robinson's smile faded, and she glanced around the yard before responding. "Community is built on shared values and traditions, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice cool. "It's not just about throwing a party." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving James standing there, feeling the sting of her words. He watched as she moved to the far side of the yard, where she continued to observe the barbecue from a distance, never fully engaging with the other guests. As the evening wore on, the Andersons tried to focus on the positive aspects of the event. Many of their neighbors were enjoying themselves, and there were moments of genuine connection and laughter. But Mrs. Robinson's presence, along with the subtle undercurrent of tension, cast a shadow over what should have been a joyous occasion. It was during this time that Mrs. Robinson, unable to contain her resentment any longer, made a decision that would change everything. She quietly slipped away from the barbecue, returning to her home across the street. There, she picked up the phone and dialed 911, her voice calm but firm as she reported a disturbance at the Andersons' address. "They're having some sort of loud gathering," she told the dispatcher. "It's disruptive, and there are too many people. I think it might be getting out of hand." As she hung up the phone, a sense of satisfaction washed over her. She had done what she believed was necessary to restore order and remind the Andersons of their place. She returned to her window, watching as the minutes ticked by, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the police. Back at the barbecue, the Andersons were unaware of what was happening. They continued to host their guests, laughing and chatting, trying to focus on the positive energy around them. But as the sun began to set and the evening light softened, the distant sound of sirens cut through the music and conversation, drawing everyone's attention. The sound grew louder, and soon police cars pulled up in front of the Andersons' house. The mood shifted abruptly, with guests falling silent, their expressions turning from joy to concern. James and Angela exchanged worried glances, unsure of what was happening. They moved to the front of the house where a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, watching as the police officers approached. As the officers stepped out of their cars, the tension in the air was palpable. The Andersons stood on their porch, waiting for the officers to speak. But as the officers drew closer, James recognized one of them, a younger officer named Officer Collins, who had recently joined the precinct. "Chief Anderson." Officer Collins greeted him with a respectful nod, his tone calm and professional. "We received a report of a disturbance here." James nodded, understanding the situation immediately. "Thank you for responding so quickly, Officer Collins," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We're hosting a neighborhood barbecue. It's been a peaceful gathering." Officer Collins glanced around, taking in the scene. A group of neighbors, many still holding plates of food, standing in the yard, looking confused but not unruly. He turned back to James, his expression serious but respectful. "I see that, sir," Officer Collins said, nodding. "It looks like everything is under control here. We'll just make a quick check and then be on our way." As the officers moved through the crowd, checking in with guests and assessing the situation, it became clear that the complaint was unfounded. The barbecue was nothing more than a friendly gathering, far from the disruptive event that Mrs. Robinson had described. The officers completed their check, then returned to James and Angela. "Everything looks good here, Chief Anderson," Officer Collins said, offering a reassuring smile. "We're sorry for the interruption. We'll head out now." James thanked the officers, relieved that the situation had been handled with professionalism and respect. As the police cars drove away, the tension began to dissipate, but the mood of the barbecue had shifted. The guests were still processing what had just happened, and the Andersons couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was a turning point. The barbecue continued for a little while longer, but the energy had changed. Guests slowly began to leave, offering their thanks and goodbyes, but the joy that had filled the evening was now tinged with unease. James and Angela did their best to remain gracious hosts, but the weight of what had just occurred lingered in their minds. As they stood in their now empty backyard, the decorations still swaying gently in the breeze, they reflected on the evening's events. What should have been a celebration of community had been marred by prejudice and mistrust. The Andersons realized that while they had hoped to create a sense of unity, there were deeper issues within the neighborhood that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Robinson's actions had exposed the underlying tensions that had simmered beneath the surface since their arrival. It was clear that not everyone was ready to accept them as part of the community, and that their presence had challenged the status quo in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. In the days following the barbecue, the Andersons found themselves at a crossroads. The incident with the police had left them shaken, but it also ignited a determination within them to confront the underlying issues that had been festering in the neighborhood. James and Angela had moved to Maplewood with the hope of building a life in a welcoming community, and they weren't ready to give up on that dream. They knew they had to take action, not just for themselves, but for their children and for the future of the neighborhood as a whole. James in particular felt a deep responsibility as both a father and the new police chief. He had dedicated his career to serving and protecting communities, and now he realized that his role extended beyond the precinct and into his own front yard. The incident at the barbecue had highlighted the deep-seated prejudices that still existed in the community, and James knew that if these issues weren't addressed, they would continue to divide the neighborhood. One evening, as James and Angela sat together in their living room, discussing the recent events, James proposed an idea. He suggested organizing a community meeting, a forum where neighbors could come together, voice their concerns, and begin the process of healing and understanding. Angela agreed wholeheartedly, seeing this as an opportunity to break down the barriers that had been erected between them and their neighbors. The next morning, James began making the necessary arrangements. He reached out to the local community center and secured a space for the meeting. He then personally drafted invitations, carefully wording them to emphasize the importance of open dialogue and mutual respect. The invitations were distributed to every household in the neighborhood, with the hope that the residents would recognize the value of coming together to address their shared concerns. As the day of the meeting approached, James felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He knew that not everyone in the neighborhood would be eager to attend, especially those who harbored the same sentiments as Mrs. Robinson. However, he also believed that there were others who, like the Andersons, wanted to see the neighborhood thrive as a diverse and inclusive community. It was these individuals that James hoped would come forward, lending their voices to the conversation. The day of the meeting arrived, and as evening fell, the Andersons made their way to the community center. They had dressed in their best, wanting to present themselves with the dignity and respect that the occasion warranted. As they entered the building, they were greeted by a few familiar faces, neighbors who had attended the barbecue and had expressed their support in the days that followed. The room slowly filled with people, some arriving alone, others in small groups. There was a palpable tension in the air, a mixture of curiosity, uncertainty, and perhaps even a hint of fear. Many of the attendees exchanged nervous glances as they took their seats, unsure of what to expect from the evening's proceedings. James stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that the success of this meeting would depend largely on how he handled it. As more people arrived, he noticed Mrs. Robinson enter the room, her expression guarded. She took a seat near the back, her posture rigid, as if she were preparing herself for battle. James made a mental note of her presence, knowing that she would likely be one of the most difficult individuals to reach. Once the room was full, James began by thanking everyone for coming and expressing his appreciation for their willingness to engage in what he hoped would be a constructive and meaningful dialogue. He spoke about the importance of community, emphasizing that a neighborhood is only as strong as the bonds that hold it together. He acknowledged the challenges they had faced since moving in and addressed the incident at the barbecue, framing it as an opportunity to confront the issues that had been simmering beneath the surface. After his opening remarks, James invited the attendees to share their thoughts and feelings, encouraging them to speak openly but respectfully. There was a moment of silence as people hesitated, unsure of who should speak first. Finally, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the neighborhood for many years, raised his hand and stood up. Mr. Thompson spoke about the changes he had seen in Maplewood over the decades. He reminisced about the days when the neighborhood was smaller, more close-knit, and predominantly homogeneous. He acknowledged that change could be difficult, especially for those who had lived in the area for a long time, but he also recognized that change was inevitable and necessary for growth. As Mr. Thompson spoke, others in the room began to nod in agreement, seemingly relieved that someone had broken the ice. Following his lead, a younger couple stood up and shared their own experiences. They spoke about how they had initially struggled to fit in when they first moved to Maplewood, but over time, they had found a sense of belonging through involvement in local activities and by reaching out to their neighbors. The conversation continued, with more people standing up to share their perspectives. Some expressed concerns about the changing demographics of the neighborhood, fearing that the sense of community they had known would be lost. Others spoke about the need for inclusivity and the importance of embracing diversity as a strength rather than a threat. Throughout it all, James listened attentively, taking mental notes of the recurring themes and undercurrents that emerged from the discussion. As the meeting progressed, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. What had started as a tense and uncertain gathering gradually evolved into a more open and honest exchange of ideas. People who had previously been hesitant to speak now found themselves engaging in the conversation, their voices contributing to the collective understanding of the issues at hand. Eventually, Mrs. Robinson stood up, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Her expression was stern, and her tone was measured as she began to speak. She acknowledged that she had been resistant to the changes in the neighborhood and that she had acted out of fear and discomfort. She admitted that the incident at the barbecue had been a result of her own prejudices, and while she stopped short of fully apologizing, she expressed a desire to move forward and find a way to coexist peacefully. Her words, though not entirely conciliatory, were a step in the right direction. James recognized the significance of her admission and responded with understanding. He reiterated the importance of working together to build a stronger, more inclusive community, and assured Mrs. Robinson that her concerns would be taken into consideration as they moved forward. The meeting concluded with a renewed sense of hope and determination. While not all issues had been resolved, the fact that the neighbors had come together and engaged in a meaningful dialogue was a victory in itself. As people filed out of the community center, many stopped to shake James's hand or offer words of encouragement, expressing their appreciation for his leadership. Over the next few weeks, the Andersons noticed a subtle but significant shift in the neighborhood. While not everyone was suddenly best friends, there was a newfound sense of openness and willingness to engage. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance now greeted the Andersons with genuine warmth, and there was a growing sense of camaraderie as people began to reach out to one another. It was during this time that Angela came up with the idea for a community garden. She had always loved gardening, finding it to be a therapeutic and rewarding activity. She believed that a shared garden could serve as a symbol of the neighborhood's growth and a way to bring people together in a positive and constructive way. Angela presented the idea to James, who immediately saw its potential. They envisioned a garden where neighbors could come together to plant, tend, and harvest vegetables, herbs, and flowers. It would be a place where people could work side by side, sharing their knowledge and experiences, and forging new connections in the process. James and Angela began reaching out to their neighbors, gauging interest in the project. To their delight, many people were enthusiastic about the idea, eager to contribute their time and resources to making the garden a reality. The Andersons organized a planning meeting, inviting anyone who was interested to come and discuss the logistics. The planning meeting was held at the Andersons' home, and it was heartening to see how many people showed up. Neighbors of all ages and backgrounds gathered around the kitchen table, sharing ideas and brainstorming ways to make the garden a success. Some offered to donate tools and supplies, while others volunteered their time to help with the initial setup. The sense of community that had been missing when the Andersons first moved in was now beginning to take root, just like the garden they were planning. Over the next several months, the community garden project came to life. A vacant lot at the edge of the neighborhood was chosen as the site, and volunteers worked tirelessly to clear the land, build raised beds, and install irrigation systems. The Andersons were at the forefront of the effort, with James using his connections to secure additional resources, and Angela leading the charge in organizing the planting schedule. As the garden began to take shape, it became a gathering place for the neighborhood. On weekends, families would come together to work in the garden, their children playing nearby while the adults tended to the plants. The garden was not just a place to grow food, it was a place to grow relationships. Neighbors who had once been strangers now shared stories, laughter, and advice as they worked side by side. Mrs. Robinson, who had initially been skeptical of the project, gradually found herself drawn to the garden as well. She started by simply observing from a distance, but over time she began to contribute in small ways, offering tips on plant care and even bringing over some seeds from her own garden. The Andersons welcomed her involvement, seeing it as a sign that the neighborhood was truly beginning to heal. As the seasons passed, the garden flourished. The once vacant lot was now a vibrant oasis, filled with rows of vegetables, fragrant herbs, and colorful flowers. The sense of pride and accomplishment that the community felt was palpable, and the garden became a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together with a shared purpose. The Andersons were deeply moved by the transformation they had witnessed. What had started as a difficult and isolating experience had evolved into something beautiful and meaningful. They had faced prejudice and resistance, but through persistence, empathy, and a commitment to inclusivity, they had helped to create a neighborhood where everyone could feel a sense of belonging. Looking back on the journey, James and Angela felt a profound sense of fulfillment. They had not only built a home in Maplewood, they had helped to build a community. The garden stood as a testament to the power of resilience and the belief that change, though often challenging, was both possible and necessary for growth. As the Andersons sat together one evening, watching the sunset over their flourishing garden, they reflected on how far they and the neighborhood had come. They knew that the work of building a strong and inclusive community was ongoing, but they were confident that Maplewood was on the right path. They had planted the seeds of change, and now they were watching them grow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood, the Andersons sat on their porch, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The community garden, now a flourishing testament to what could be achieved through unity and cooperation, stood proudly at the edge of the neighborhood, its vibrant colors and rich greenery a stark contrast to the tensions and divisions that had once defined Maplewood. The Andersons were deeply aware that their journey had been far from easy. They had faced resistance and hostility, not just from Mrs. Robinson, but from the undercurrents of prejudice that had permeated the community when they first arrived. But now, sitting together, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment and pride. They had not only persevered through adversity, but had also managed to effect real change in their community. As they sat quietly, the sound of the evening breeze rustling through the trees mingled with the distant laughter of children playing near the garden. It was a sound that had become increasingly common in recent months, a sign that the neighborhood was evolving into a place of inclusion and shared purpose. The Andersons had noticed how the garden had become a hub for the community, attracting people of all ages and backgrounds, each contributing in their own way to its success. Angela, with her love for teaching, had taken it upon herself to organize weekly gardening workshops for the children. She would gather them in the garden on Saturday mornings, showing them how to plant seeds, tend to the growing plants, and understand the importance of nurturing life. The children, including Maya and Caleb, eagerly looked forward to these sessions, their laughter and curiosity filling the garden with life. For Angela, these moments were especially rewarding. She could see the impact they were having not just on the children, but on the parents who watched with pride as their kids learned and grew alongside the plants. James, too, found himself increasingly involved in the life of the garden. His leadership as the police chief had always been centered on building trust and fostering communication, and he saw the garden as an extension of that mission. He spent many afternoons working alongside neighbors, breaking down the barriers that had once separated them. Whether he was turning soil, repairing a fence, or simply sharing a conversation, James knew that the garden was more than just a physical space. It was a symbol of the trust and solidarity that were slowly but surely taking root in Maplewood. One evening, as the Andersons walked through the garden together, they noticed something that brought tears to their eyes. In one corner of the garden, near a patch of sunflowers that had become a favorite among the children, someone had placed a small hand-painted sign. It read, "Together we grow." The simplicity of the message moved them deeply, encapsulating everything they had worked for and everything the garden had come to represent. The sign became a focal point in the garden, drawing the attention of everyone who visited. It was a reminder that the garden, like the community itself, was a collaborative effort, nurtured by the contributions of many. Neighbors who had once been wary of each other now exchanged smiles and greetings as they worked side by side, united by a common purpose. The divisions that had once seemed so insurmountable were slowly dissolving, replaced by a sense of shared responsibility and mutual respect. Even Mrs. Robinson, who had once stood as the most formidable obstacle to the Andersons' acceptance in the neighborhood, had undergone a transformation. Her initial involvement in the garden had been tentative, marked by a reluctance to fully engage with the community. But over time, as she witnessed the positive impact the garden was having on the neighborhood, her attitude began to soften. She started spending more time in the garden, offering advice based on her years of experience as a gardener. She even began to form connections with neighbors she had previously kept at arm's length. One day, as James was working in the garden, Mrs. Robinson approached him, a small pot of seedlings in her hands. She hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts before speaking. "Chief Anderson," she began, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I wanted to contribute these to the garden. They're heirloom tomatoes. My mother used to grow them in her garden, and they've been in my family for generations. I thought they might do well here." James looked at her, touched by the gesture. He could see that this was more than just an offering of plants. It was an olive branch, a way for Mrs. Robinson to finally let go of the past and embrace the new reality of the neighborhood. "Thank you, Mrs. Robinson," James replied warmly. "I'm sure they'll be a wonderful addition to the garden, and it means a lot that you're sharing a part of your family's history with us." They planted the seedlings together, working in companionable silence. As they finished, Mrs. Robinson looked around the garden, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said slowly, "I've lived in Maplewood for a long time. I've seen a lot of changes over the years, but I never imagined anything like this. It's different, but it's good. I'm glad you and your family moved here." James smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "We're glad to be here, Mrs. Robinson, and we're glad to be a part of this community." The relationship between the Andersons and Mrs. Robinson continued to evolve, becoming one of mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension and disagreement, but the progress they had made was undeniable. Mrs. Robinson even began to take an active role in the community garden, helping to organize planting schedules and offering her expertise to anyone who needed it. The garden had become a place of healing for her, just as it had for the rest of the neighborhood. As the seasons changed, so did Maplewood. The garden became a year-round project, with neighbors working together to prepare the soil in the spring, harvest in the summer, and winterize the beds in the fall. The sense of community that had been cultivated in the garden began to spill over into other aspects of neighborhood life. Block parties, potlucks, and holiday celebrations became more common, each event drawing larger and more diverse crowds. The neighborhood, once divided, was now coming together in ways that few could have imagined when the Andersons first arrived. The impact of the Andersons' efforts reached beyond Maplewood as well. News of the community garden and the transformation it had sparked spread to other neighborhoods and even to the local media. A reporter from the city newspaper visited the garden, interviewing James, Angela, and several of their neighbors for a feature story. The article, titled "Growing Together: How a Garden Transformed a Neighborhood," highlighted the positive changes that had taken place in Maplewood and served as an inspiration to other communities facing similar challenges. The Andersons received letters and emails from people across the city, thanking them for their leadership and sharing their own stories of community-building efforts. Some even came to visit the garden, hoping to learn from Maplewood's experience and bring similar projects to their own neighborhoods. The garden had become more than just a local success. It was now a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together with open hearts and a shared vision. One day, as the Andersons were tending to the garden, a young couple approached them. They introduced themselves as the Garcias and explained that they had recently moved to Maplewood. They had heard about the garden and wanted to get involved. "We're new here," Mrs. Garcia said with a smile, "and we're looking for a way to meet people and become part of the community. We've heard such wonderful things about the garden and the people who helped create it. We'd love to contribute in any way we can." Angela beamed at them, remembering how she and James had felt when they first moved to Maplewood. "We'd be delighted to have you join us," she said warmly. "The garden is always in need of helping hands, and it's a great way to get to know your neighbors." The Garcias quickly became regulars at the garden, bringing with them fresh ideas and new energy. Their involvement was a reminder to the Andersons of how far the neighborhood had come. They had arrived as strangers, faced challenges, and through perseverance and a commitment to building a better community, they had helped to create a place where new families like the Garcias could feel welcomed and included. As the Andersons looked around the garden, now bustling with activity, they felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. They had not only built a home in Maplewood, they had helped to build a community. The garden stood as a testament to the power of resilience, compassion, and the belief that change, though often difficult, was both necessary and possible. In the years to come, the garden continued to thrive, becoming a permanent fixture in the neighborhood and a source of pride for everyone involved. The Andersons' children, Maya and Caleb, grew up with the garden as a central part of their lives, learning valuable lessons about teamwork, responsibility, and the importance of giving back to the community. They too took on leadership roles as they got older, helping to mentor younger children and passing on the knowledge and values they had learned from their parents. The Andersons knew that the work of building a strong and inclusive community was ongoing, but they were confident that Maplewood was on the right path. The garden, once just an idea, had become a living symbol of the neighborhood's transformation, a place where diversity was celebrated, where differences were embraced, and where everyone had a role to play in the collective success of the community. As they sat together one evening watching the sunset over their flourishing garden, James and Angela held hands, feeling a deep sense of peace. They had planted the seeds of change, and now they were watching them grow.